Mmcd, President of the Guild of Students at Liverpool. Thank you very much, Manu.
Thank you. Yes, I'm the President of Liverpool Guild of Students and a student activist, and I act nationally. I'm just going to share with you my analysis of where the UK fits under the European Against Austerity movement. The situation here has gone on so long that a lot of young people have become desensitised to the severity of the shift in politics and government policy. At the beginning of the crisis in 2008, we saw a catastrophic failure of free market policies and an unprecedented response as governments intervened early and often to guarantee the profits of banks and corporations at the expense of the workers and the unemployed and students. So in 2011 we saw the mass mobilisation of students in the UK fight back against the austerity measures, and these protests highlighted the frustration against the youth of the increase of tuition fees and the continuing barrier to education. We were a part of a growing movement for change at a time of deep economic crisis, and it was a popular protest that also inspired the trade unions. And that's why on November 30th it was so important that the students and trade unions stood together to provide a united front against the reality of the austerity measures of the illegitimate coalition government. And our long-term grievances of this austerity is not just the cuts in education, but also across the welfare state, and demonstrations and protests are how we come to voice our opposition at the economic failure of capitalism. But we're being beaten and criminalised for resisting the government's policies across Europe. We only need to look at Birmingham University, where the students there went into occupation recently against the Higher Education White Paper, and they've launched an injunction upon students who want to protest, totally undermining our strategy of expressing our discontent. And it's an attempt to divide us, but still, we're fighting back against austerity. I mean, James gave great analysis on Greece, but I think, if we do look at Greece, where a technocrat government has loaded austerity after austerity on ordinary people who are now found rioting in the streets, sleeping in doorways, and throwing themselves off buildings, it's desperate. Or we could look to Portugal, where the general strike is being planned for March to oppose these devastating changes in longer working hours, holiday pay being cut, pensions attacked, public sectors and services being cut down. But the workforces of these countries are not facing some natural economic storm or inevitable catastrophe. It's austerity failing. Even in Germany, Europe's largest economy, growth is expected at just 1% this year. And the poverty being inflicted on the peripheral countries that James talked about is matched by the political bankruptcy of those who say that economic growth is the only important measure of economic success, but whose ruthless austerity programme can't even deliver on its own terms. And here in Britain, the Conservative government is breaking new records in its own commitment to unemployment, expensive education and privatised healthcare. The government seems determined to spend nothing on its people, and it seems like a war in Iran is the only thing worth funding at the minute. And our reaction to this situation needs to be twofold. On one hand, we must acknowledge the need for a European movement of anti-austerity that we need to be a part of, and this movement should defend a social Europe, one that safeguards workers' rights, equality, freedom of movement, expression and organisation. But on the other hand, we must also build a movement that understands that the institutions of the European Union are dominated by corporate, financial and military interests. We need our own independent movement, and in short, we need a movement that is for a people's Europe, not for a boss's Europe. And we want an economy built around the interests of workers and students, not the bankers. Here in the UK, we can see that the government is deeply unpopular, but it has maintained its position by deflecting anger away from itself and onto the unemployed and minorities. But there's a more important reason why this government survives despite its dreadful attacks on millions of people. And I think the traditional role of mass opposition, you would think would come from the Labour Party. After all, it's the biggest party outside of government. It's funded by the trade unions, so it ought to be throwing its weight behind the massive public sector strikes over pensions, not condemning them. It ought to be thrown its weight behind the students who are now burdened with debt, and it ought to be thrown its weight behind the NHS, which is now swamped with private companies. But in all the major issues, the Labour Party refuses to commit to undoing the worst attacks that the illegitimate government has provided. These people, promise everything and deliver nothing, and we should be really clear about this, that principled opposition is much better than collaborative government. And this is true for the Lib Dems, who argue that they're actually holding back the Tories, when in reality they're giving a progressive face to the ruthless forces of the Conservatives. And that's why we need a political alternative, one that says an emphatic no to every aspect of austerity, but that also puts forward a different kind of world, one where a third-level education is considered important enough to fund from the public purse, where investment in young people is a priority. And this alternative is desperately needed, but we cannot rely on it emerging from nowhere. And as students, and as part of the wider battle, we need to build around this by campaigning. We need to build on from the past student protests, and that's why millions of young people across Europe are taking part in the Occupy movements, and sit-ins and occupations and marches and demonstrations. These are all clear cut examples of our opposition. And despite the monolithic block of opposition that the media has portrayed of young people fighting back, we're still demanding better. Green Party activists are at the centre of the protest against Tesco and the use of workfare in Britain in 2012. It's absolutely outrageous and unacceptable for people to go to work for nothing, especially for a company that accounts for something like 6 or 7 in every £10 in retail being spent. But we need more of this kind of action everywhere and at every level, and we need to be building locally and acting nationally as part of the growing movement against austerity. It's very important that we see ourselves as a part of this movement. We've been forced into direct action on the NHS too. The government is determined to exclude us from the conversation, so that elderly women actually threw themselves to ambush Lansley as he arrived on Downing Street. And it's terrifying, genuinely terrifying to think that despite the huge failure of free market capitalism, as demonstrated in the past, that they're not going to put schools and hospitals into the fire. And the next time there's a crash, it won't just be banks and shops, it will be the companies that have been entrusted to educate our young people and to look after our sick as well. And that's why the fight against austerity is urgent, and it requires unity among the trade unions, student unions and community groups. The stakes are high, but I do think that it's a battle that we can win, and we are a vast majority with a vested interest in people and our planet and not in profit. And I think that 2011 was the year of revolution, and who knows what's in store for 2012. But just as the people of Tunisia and Egypt have put years of tyranny into the dustbin, so too should we destroy forever the notion that we need more poverty to restore profit, we need more pollution to restore the environment, and more war to restore peace. And we must keep that resistance and remain at the centre of activity. And the movement against austerity can do all these things, and let's look forward to celebrating our own anti-austerity spring.
President of Student Union Liverpool. And now we have our final speaker, Chris Boff, Assistant General Secretary of PCS, who, as I said before,